Okay, it's time for me to finish my series of videos about the entirety of the Bret Easton Ellis canon. Now that I've read it all, now that I've read every single book that he's put out, um, I thought that this would be a useful thing to do. So I've commented on I've done. I guess he has not a total of 9 published books, and I've done a total of 3 books per video. So for part one and part two, or about part one was about the first 3 books that he wrote, chronologically speaking. Part two was about the second 3, and part three will be about the latest 3. I say the latest, not the last, because he's still very much alive, and hopefully we'll get a lot more out of him before his time on Earth is over. But I'm going to get out of chronology a little bit with the discussion of these last 3 books, because I want to. It so happens that of the last 3 that he's written, one of them is nonfiction, and that's his book White, which was published around 2019. But I want to consider his 2 fiction books. Just stretching here. Just kind of woke up about an hour ago, and but that's not germane or pertinent. But I want to discuss Imperial Bedrooms, his book from 2009, and his latest, The Shards, which was, I think, actually published in 2023, although it was serially published in portions online on on Bret's site, uh, his Patreon site. So what I find interesting and worth drawing attention to, of course, these are not comprehensive considerations of these books at all. These are just my passing impressions of them. But what I think is interesting about not just Imperial Bedrooms and the Shards, but also the I would also include Lunar Park, the last of the second 3 books that I considered. Lunar Park, which was published in, I believe, 2005. In that it seems that in all of his latest fiction, in order for Ellis to feel like he can gain entree to the world of fiction again, it seems that he has to do this weirdly complicated thing where he somehow reformulates himself as a character, uh, and puts himself in the midst of the work that he had previously created. So it's I guess, of course, the term postmodern gets applied to too many things, and it's a kind of annoying term. But one of the attributes of postmodernity in art is self-awareness. It's sort of the artist drawing attention to himself, or showing an awareness of himself in the midst of his creation, and causing you to consider the work as it was, um, sort of the how the sausage gets made kind of thing, where you don't just think about what's on the page. You're forced to also think about what led to the the work on the page becoming the way that it is, and how it exists in concert with the author's awareness of himself. And now, the way I'm describing it here sounds rather tedious and maybe even somewhat pompous. Like who does he? I could hear some people thinking, who does he think he is? Why is he? Why does the author think he's that important? What does he think that people want to know about him? And I get that, but the thing is, I think that Ellis gets that too, and I don't think he's doing this. I don't think he's been doing this to out of a sense of his own importance as an author. It's just somehow what makes the work interesting to him again, interesting enough to engage with the fiction again. He's as I've stated before, he's not a prolific writer, and he only writes when inspiration strikes. He doesn't write when he feels a compulsion where he's under contract to do so. In fact, his age we're given to understand that his agents, those around him, would much rather that he had written much more prolifically. But instead of like every few years, every couple times a decade, as it turns out. So that makes it interesting to ask why does he write when he does write? And it seems to me that there's something about the idea, at least for the past 20, 25 years or so. It seems that it's been hard for Ellis to gain entree to his own work without somehow inserting some version of himself in it. Now, in Lunar Park, which, as I've said before, is actually my favorite of all of his books. In that book, he chooses to become a version of himself in this alternate world that's a lot like ours, but has some significant differences as well. And so the Bret Easton Ellis that we meet in that book is also significantly different from the Ellis that we know in this world. And in Imperial Bedrooms, what we have, which I think is his shortest book, by the way, in Imperial Bedrooms, we have a re-examination or a re-engagement with the characters from Less Than Zero as grown-ups, as now people in their, I guess, 40s. It would be around that time. When we met them in Less Than Zero, they were teenagers, or at most maybe 20 or 21. They were all quite young, and now they're grown up, and their lives are quite a bit more complicated. And what Ellis does in that book is he takes on the voice of Clay, the character of Clay, the protagonist of Less Than Zero, and he claims, however, that Bret Easton Ellis, the author of Less Than Zero, didn't really write Less Than Zero, or he wrote it. Whoever wrote it was sort of represented things fraudulently, and that it didn't really that the details were changed around, and so in Imperial Bedrooms, we're seeing who this Clay character really is, or what he has become. And Clay is somebody who is very much a Bret Easton Ellis, a dark Bret Easton Ellis clone. Let's just say he is Bret Easton Ellis in all but name, and because he plays an author and somebody who's been involved in who's returned to to Hollywood to take part in the production of a movie, a script that he's written. That maybe I can't remember. Maybe is based on a book that he's written. But this was around the time when Ellis was himself was trying to get his stuff. Was involved in script writing and trying to get involved in the movie business. And he's still somewhat in that realm, although he speaks very deprecatingly about himself. When he does talk about it, he talks about how most of what he tried to do, he failed to do, or his projects never got off the ground, or people actually paid him for contributing scripts or possible material, but that they still never ended up using it. Which, to my mind, I don't know whether that's something I wouldn't mind doing. It would be a little frustrating to never see your stuff reach fruition. But on the other hand, if you're getting paid to just write stuff that never gets made, and probably getting paid pretty well, then that's not a bad way to live. So, but in Imperial Bedrooms, we meet a lot of the former cast, if you will, of Less Than Zero, and it becomes this story of Clay remembering his childhood, remembering how he was brought up, remembering these things about himself. But what we ultimately find out about Clay is that he's a much darker sort of character than he was originally portrayed in Less Than Zero, or maybe he's developed that way. In a way, all of Ellis's work is, with the exception of Lunar Park, I think can be said to be pretty dark, or at least not characterized by happy endings. And I think what gives Lunar Park what gives Imperial Bedrooms, what makes it powerful to read, is that the more we find out about Clay, the darker, and he's the narrator. He's of course the one through whom we're finding out about everything else, all the how he still relates to the figures of his youth, what's become of them. Of course, in their youth, they were also, they were far from innocent people. They were like these kind of feral youth, with who are all on drugs and promiscuous and stuff. So in some ways, they were like living like irresponsible grown-ups when they were actually just kids. And now, as grown-ups, we see that Clay has gone from this figure of like the closest thing to innocence in Less Than Zero. He's not a bad. We get the impression he's not a bad guy, but he's somebody who just is too passive. He sees the world around him, and he sees a lot of the things that happen in the world around him, and sees a lot of what's wrong with it. But instead of taking a stand against it, he just backs down, more or less, and because it's not really in his nature, or he can't find it in him to actually do what would be heroic, or what would be I'm trying to search for the right word, appreciable, what would be admirable. But in in Imperial Bedrooms, we see that Clay has become thoroughly corrupted, and it gets revealed more and more to us that Clay is the real bad guy. There's some, at the beginning of the book, somebody is following him. He's being menaced. He's being threatened by some unknown source. But the more we find out about Clay, again, the more he becomes somehow the hero, so called, the protagonist. Is become we become no we become aware of his growing depravity. The more we read, and the closer we get to the end of the book. And the same is in a way true of the Shards. Not to give anything away, because the Shards is which is his most recently written work. The Shards is kind of a murder mystery. It's about a and just like in Lunar Park, and just like in Imperial Bedrooms, it's set in a world which is like our own, but some details are different. And just like with Lunar Park, the main character is Bret Easton Ellis, but here it's Bret Easton Ellis as a teenager. So in a way, it's a return to the less than zero-esque world. But it reads much more like an autobiography. It reads much more like a confessional. And as does Lunar Park. I remember I said in the video where I was discussing Lunar Park, I remember I made the observation that the first few chapters of the book, the first, I don't know, 50 to 70 pages or so, it really sounds like this is Ellis just reflecting back on his his youth and what it was like to find success at such a young age, and it sounds very convincing. But then you start hearing little details about him doing this or doing that, and hanging out with big movie stars, and getting photographed everywhere, and being part of this literary brat pack, and everything. And we ultimately see that he's kind of making fun of the idea of how glamorous some people thought he was. By sort of becoming this decadent rock star character that he really wasn't. He wasn't. He didn't do the kind of things that some people thought he did. He didn't hang out with or know personally. Like these big movie stars, or be intimate friends with these big movie stars. That in the way that, and be on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine the way that people thought. And in the Shards, at first it seems like this is Ellis trying to tell the story about what happened, some of the traumatic things that happened during his senior year of high school, and how there was a killer out there, and how one of his fellow students is someone he suspects of being a killer. And part of the story is him following this guy, seeing what he's up to, and playing detective essentially. But it's also about Ellis's. This is the most in this book. Ellis, I guess today, talks about himself as being gay, but in his early work and his middle work, this was much more muted, or his characters the material, the sexual material in his books was at least, if not straight heterosexual, then it was just heterosexuality mixed with a bit of homosexuality. So it was more like there was it was, you could say, bisexual. And one still gets the impression that Ellis, is somebody who's been with both women and men in his life. But he seems to just identify, quote unquote, as, because I don't like that word, I identify as this. But if one were to talk about him identifying as something today, as he's reached his 60s, he seems to think of himself as gay. Now, he's also a very, very politically incorrect homosexual, which we'll get to in a minute when I talk about white. And that's part of what I admire about him, and that's part of what I think makes him interesting. But in the Shards, there's a lot of he has affairs with. I shouldn't even say affairs. It's more tawdry than that. He sleeps with a couple of his classmates, one of whom also becomes a murder victim, and he's attracted. He's both enemies with and also attracted to the guy he thinks is the murderer. But as the story goes on, similar to Imperial Bedrooms, we find that the answer is, again, I'm not going to give away the ending, but the answer is that there's some ambiguity about the one telling the story, and what role he's playing, and maybe he could be murderous himself. He could be certainly capable of murder. He has a very dark side. A lot of Ellis's work is about that. About, he writes from the point of view of characters. Especially Patrick Bateman comes to mind. Of course, is the biggest example of this. He writes from the point of view of characters who are sociopathic, and sometimes murderers, or at least capable of great evil deeds. And that's such a prominent theme in Ellis's work that it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder about the guy and what he's actually done in his life, what he might actually have to confess, and if he was really actually talking about his past. Now, Ellis seems like a really, really nice guy. I should say that he's quite down to earth. He's quite likable, and somewhat self-effacing, humble. Not at all like you'd expect him to be from his writing. But you still, when you read these stories, I'm not saying he's done anything illegal or really, really bad, but you do wonder about when the realm of one's fiction is always that kind of stuff. You're forced to wonder about what sort of secrets he actually has, what sort of things he's actually done, besides maybe a sometimes tawdry sex life, which I think is probably something he would admit to. So that's the Shards, and the other work of his to discuss is something called White. This is a collection of essays, and I recommend. A lot of people out there aren't fiction readers, and I was this way for a good chunk of time. I remember I read a lot of fiction in my youth, and then there was a time period, maybe for a decade or so, maybe even longer than that, where I read a lot, but I read absolutely no fiction. And I think that for a lot of people, especially men, it seems like, uh, like it seems like almost, if you're a reader at all, which is harder to find these days than in the past. But if you're a man, if you're a reader, you there a lot of men just seem to become exclusively nonfiction readers. So if you're one of those, and you don't and that's keeping you from reading Ellis's fiction, I would recommend picking up White, especially if you enjoy some reading somebody who's countercultural and extremely critical of political correctness and wokeness and liberalism, even as he's an openly homosexual man. Um, he's very down on the whole idea of claiming victimhood or of promoting homosexuality or homosexuals as superior people, or or any other kinds of politically correct pandering. He's violently opposed to all of it, and this all came to a head with the Trump phenomenon and how he saw all of his, or not all of his friends, but a bunch of his friends just lose their minds over Donald Trump. And he is not a supporter of Trump, but he's not against Trump, and he refused to think, oh my God, things are terrible now that Trump is president, and what's happening. We've got to be outraged all the time. That seems to have been what really set him off, and made the writing of White, or the made the writing of the essays that are collected in White, be be ultimately written. He talks about the ways in which he sees that celebrity culture has changed for the worse. How people who were celebrities used to be able to open up about things, but now they've become overly concerned in his mind with saying the right thing, not not uh, not saying anything that could be construed in a negative way uh, by anyone who's powerful or influential, and thus be quote unquote canceled. And he's very open in his dismay about this societal change. He's also a big cinephile, big lover of movies, and he talks about, you know in he makes observations about cinema, whether it's certain movie stars or certain directors or certain styles of cinema, um, that he's seen. He's friends with Quentin Tarantino, I believe. I don't know how close they are, but uh, if you've ever heard Tarantino talk about movies, and he's somebody who's very who doesn't really check his speech at all, um, and who could also be said to be anti woke, even though Tarantino is, I think, like he votes Democrat and stuff, and maybe calls himself a liberal, but he seems to not be. He seems to be, very sincerely anti woke. Um, but a lot of Ellis's observations about cinema uh, is similar. I would say are Tarantino esque. They seem to be cut from similar cloths as far as their understanding and appreciation of cinema as an art form. So that concludes my consideration of the works of Bret Easton Ellis.